Centuries of Oppression, The Road to 1918. Chapter 24. If World War I had not happened, would universal suffrage have occurred anyway? If the war had not intervened, would a major reform act, including some measure of female suffrage, have been passed in any case? It is impossible to say with certainty. One must accept that the progress of human affairs is chaotic in the strict mathematical sense of being unpredictable. The very occurrence of the war is testament to that. So if the war had not happened, who's to say what other occurrences might have either precipitated or prevented a similar reform act? The NUWSS strategy was to put female suffrage on the Liberal agenda for the next general election. Holton opines that, in view of the fact that negotiations between the suffragists and the government were taking place just 2 weeks before the outbreak of war, there is every reason to suppose that it would have been. But Asquith and Lloyd George had slipped out of such political nooses before, and might well have done so again. They clearly had concerns regarding attempting to defeat the big snag by jumping either way. Indefinite delay had been their policy thus far. Moreover, militancy was still a barrier to progress, and this no longer meant just the WSPU. Dissident militant groups had recently broken away from the WSPU due to their desire to pursue universal suffrage. These included the East London Federation and the United Suffragists. The only Pankhurst left as a serious contender in the game was thus Sylvia, who led the East London group. It was she, together with George Lansbury, with whom the government had been negotiating so close to the war. But claims that she was about to throw in her lot with the constitutionalists are unproven. The government's negotiations, so called, with her might equally well have been an attempt to gain intelligence about the likely development of serious male-led militancy by syndicalist workers. Recall that the Great Unrest was the backdrop here. The constitutionalists, even some of the Marxist elements, were worried about this tendency towards violent revolution. Holton quotes Catherine Marshall's perspective as follows: "The great mission awaiting women is to help keep the great revolution which is coming on sane and human lines. I believe women will have no small voice in determining the manner in which that revolution is brought about." She declared that she was disturbed by the growing links becoming apparent between sections of the suffrage movement and revolutionary socialist groups. And she expressed the concern that the women, instead of having a steadying influence in the social upheaval that is coming, will have the opposite effect, reinforcing all that is most violent and uncontrolled and bitter. I think the prospect is rapidly becoming very serious. These fears were not unfounded. Sylvia Pankhurst's East London Federation was closely associated with the Daily Herald League, who had grown disillusioned with mainstream political methods and had adopted syndicalism as their preferred means of achieving socialism. Recall, this means anarchy and violence. Here's another extract from Holton. "In the East End, Sylvia Pankhurst successfully escaped rearrest under the protection of Kosher Hunt, a noted prize fighter of the district. Militant demonstrations in this area now included large numbers of men. Many demonstrators carried sticks to parry police truncheons. Others made use of a Saturday night of knotted rope. Sylvia Pankhurst recalled, 'I saw that the police now shrank from attacking us in the East End. I wanted that shrinking accentuated. a people's army began to drill, committed to full adult suffrage, and intended to defend participants in a projected rent strike. The Marxist, communist, syndicalist nature of the militant wing of the merging male and female interests were noted by George Lansbury. He recalled a meeting which included many of the dissident militants who, he quoted, all wore red caps and who had been likened in the press to Miss Defarge and her knitting. One could take a cynical view that World War I came along conveniently in time for the British establishment to dispatch the Bolshevik element abroad to the trenches. Be that as it may, these observations emphasise how fragile would be any attempt to address the counterfactual, what would have happened if World War I hadn't. Had male-led, hence dangerous, militancy expanded under the tutelage of Tom Mann and Sylvia Pankhurst, the British establishment would undoubtedly have suppressed it with military force. While the British heyday of crushing seditious uprisings in the colonies were some years past, they still had the capacity and the will so to do. I make these remarks only to demonstrate that alternative histories can only ever be fictions. Nevertheless, there is a strong case that the momentum was now behind universal adult suffrage. One could argue that it was only a matter of time, but one could have argued that at any time since 1884, and here they were 30 years later, no further forward. Who's to say that universal suffrage might not have taken another 30 years had World War I not intervened? Unlikely perhaps, but suppose Lloyd George had proved sneaky enough to delay the matter. He was followed by a Conservative government. They would not have put forward a universal suffrage bill, but they might have passed a bill for limited suffrage of respectable women, along the lines that Mrs. Pankhurst had favoured. Who knows, if these new women voters had proved to be predominantly Tory or Liberal voters, they may subsequently have kept Ramsay MacDonald out of office. In that case, we may have arrived at the 1939-45 war with the working class of both sexes still not enfranchised. Please don't shout that if World War I had not happened, then probably World War II would not have happened either. I know. I don't mean any of this wild speculation to be taken seriously, except as a refutation of the suggestion that one could deduce what would have happened had World War I not happened. We just couldn't. What we do know is that World War I did happen. And what we do know is that the 1918 Representation of the People Act was conceived and passed during the execution of that conflict and for reasons intimately associated with that conflict.